My name is Jared Staubach. I'm an ecologist at Smithsonian's Conservation Biology Institute. I'm very pleased to be moderating this important topic entitled Ensuring Landscape Integrity while Promoting Livestock Profitability. Today we have three experts that will be speaking about two different landscapes in Africa, providing different case study examples of what's working in conservation. Importantly, which includes engaging with the community and incorporating livestock into management plans. So to my far left is Dr. John Weldon McNutt, aka Tico. Tico has lived in Botswana since 1989 when he started the Botswana Wild Dog Research Project, most of those years living in a small tented field research camp near the Moremi Game Reserve, where he finished his PhD. He is the director of the Botswana Predator Conservation Program, now a program of Wild Entrust Africa, a locally registered NGO in Botswana he co-founded with his wife, Leslie. He now supervises field research with numerous postdoctoral researchers, PhD students, international collaborators, and research assistants, and has authored and co-authored more than 100 published papers, mostly on African wild dogs. Our second expert is just to my left here, Llewellyn Dyer. Llewellyn was born and raised on Borana Conservancy in northern Kenya. He began his career working in anti-poaching on community-owned land in southern Kenya, where he got firsthand experience of the impacts of human-wildlife conflict in degraded landscapes. This experience brought Llewellyn back to Borana in 2013, where he is currently the conservation, logistics, and regeneration manager working on various projects, and not just on Borana, but on community-owned land, importantly, across northern Kenya. And then lastly, to my right, is Ryan Mitchell. Ryan has been based in Kenya as the operation manager on Ol Jogi Wildlife Conservancy for just over 2 years. He oversees a wide array of projects on the Conservancy, including the land restoration activities, which encompasses the livestock rotational grazing program. Prior to his current role, Ryan's journey into wildlife conservation and protected area management began in South Africa, where he pursued his studies in nature conservation at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. We basically have broken this session into three parts. The first is really focused on how each of these individuals and their institutions are monitoring the landscape. And so I'm going to give each person an opportunity to talk about specifically what they're doing. And then we really want to move into how they have started the conversation with the community, the engagements with the community. And then lastly, what are the tools that are helping to facilitate land and wildlife restoration across these regions. So I thought maybe, Tico, we could start with you with your program and what you've been learning over time.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. I expect you're probably wondering why someone with a PhD in behavioral ecology who's spent their life doing science on African wild dogs is here talking to you about cows. But there's a really important connection here, and it's really born of the fact that I worked with the National Geographic's Big Cats Initiative for 7 years, a granting agency that was focused specifically on, mostly on lion conservation, with the hope of developing and funding interventions that had meaningful impacts on the sustainability of Africa's lions populations. And after 7 years, that program sort of ended as phase one, and the principals and I sat together and said, well, what have we accomplished? We've given away $2.25 million over 7 years for lion conservation projects. What did we do that we accomplished? And it was pretty simple to review what we'd done. And the only thing that we thought was really meaningful, and for the past several years, the latter years of the Big Cats Initiative, was we were funding livestock husbandry programs, interventions that literally just addressed the way people manage cows. And so the conclusion was pretty obvious. If we're going to have a long-term sustainable future for predators, lions, not just lions, but all predators, we have to really focus our attention on cows. And so in the Botswana context, We have a very healthy lion population that's in wildlife managed areas. It's fenced primarily within the wildlife managed areas and the protected areas of the Okavango Delta and the Kwando Linyanti and various parts of Botswana, northern Botswana in particular. But outside those fences, we have rural communities living primarily as subsistence agriculture farmers, livestock farmers. And they live in a red zone. And I don't know whether all of you know that the world is divided into green zone and red zone, which is a designation by the World Organization for Animal Health that has to do with managing the disease risks associated with overlapping with wildlife. And red zone farmers, in the context of market access and export of animal products, are severely compromised by the fact that they live in areas that are declared red zone because they live with wildlife. So not surprisingly, most of the red zone farmers, if they're seeking international markets for their products, they live in a constant sense of antagonism with wildlife. And so policies and legislation that are not just domestic legislation and policies, but international, have really worked against a coexistence program where these rural communities can actually live comfortably and maintain viable livestock industries with living with wildlife. So within the context of the greater landscape connectivity, where we all understand that for large carnivores to have a long-term future, we're really trying to establish a model where connectivity includes landscapes that have these subsistence agriculture people living in villages where they can in fact coexist with all wildlife, not just predators. So what does that mean? Well, we have implemented, now I spend all my time working in this coexistence program, which, as conservationists, we have to figure out how people can coexist with wildlife in order to establish and maintain the connectivity that exists in these larger landscapes. Because otherwise we're going to be looking at predators in a more and more isolated, little fragmented, almost a large zoo kind of situation. And so what does it mean? Well, we need to embrace, there's many moving parts to this. So we need to embrace husbandry and improving husbandry practices. We need to provide access to markets and help the red zone farmers who have been precluded from actually having access to international markets, and in many cases even domestic markets, because disease outbreaks have shut down their industries altogether, as often as not during the last 2 decades. So market access, planned grazing, husbandry, stock improvement, and human-wildlife conflict mitigation are all parts of this story of what do we do, what do we mean by working to establish a coexistence model. So that's what we do in our Wild Entrust program called Community Coexistence, and it has many moving parts, but they all have to be implemented, they all have to be in place for it to be effective. We have to have a viable livestock industry for these communities to actually be talking about and accepting the idea that they can live with wildlife. So that's sort of setting the stage for some of the details that my colleagues here are going to talk about in their context.
Yeah, and I'm also guessing that you probably didn't think when you started your study on wild dogs you'd spend so much time focused on livestock over time.
Yeah, no, the truth is I know more about the beef industry than I ever wanted to, but that's the reality. And as I say, after the Big Cats Initiative, we realized if we're going to have a future for carnivores, we got to deal with livestock. That's the reality.
Yeah, so we'll shift to a different region. Maybe you can give us just a little bit of perspective on what's life up north in Borana.
Yeah, so I'm from Borana Conservancy, which was a cattle ranch and is now a mixed cattle ranch wildlife conservancy with black rhino habitat. We are very close to Ol Jogi, and all of our immediate neighbors are from pastoralist communities. So we have, for a very long time, had a very close livestock management relationship with our local communities that originated with like drought relief grazing. But we saw that actually we had an opportunity to shift it from kind of a charitable giving or leasing of grazing to we implemented something called the Livestock to Market program, which enables our local communities, they have a committee that enables them to put forward livestock of a certain category. So we do not take, during the green season, we will not take breeding livestock, we will only take finishing livestock. We then basically will manage them within the conservancy, fatten them up, find a market, sell them, and then basically 80% of we keep only 20% of the uplift in value of the livestock, which basically goes as a management, veterinary, and then insurance against predation. So what it means is that we are shifting the opinion of how people value livestock in that environment from purely a numbers game to an actual, cash in the bank kind of an idea. So it enables us to have a beneficial economic impact in our surrounding communities, as well as educating them about beginning the conversation of appropriate rangeland management and livestock management outside of the conservancy. Because, as we all know, livestock can be devastating if they're not managed correctly, but they can also be our primary tool for reversing degradation. And it's, I think, where we're quite unique in that because we were cattle people beforehand, we see cattle as an essential rangeland management tool, not as something that should be excluded and pushed out of the way in favor of rhino and elephant. Because often, we might value rhino and elephant, but quite often the people who are living in that landscape, they value their livestock way more. So if you're in conflict with their values, then it makes it much harder to get things done. Whereas if you align yourself with their cultural values, then it enables us to push the conversation in a beneficial direction. Yeah, is that right?
Yeah. Do you want to talk actually a little bit about these livestock pressures and what you're seeing, and perhaps like the tools that you're using to monitor?
Yes, I can. So I don't know if we just flick through a couple of these slides to, so next one. Okay, so these are just two to give you an idea over time of the change that we've seen. Obviously, the big black box is Borana, and this is from 1986, just from Google Earth. And if you flick to the next one, which is 2020, you can see there's a very significant difference. We're starting to get very, very hard boundary lines. And this is, a factor of, increased population and mismanagement of livestock within those areas, which is leading to exponentially worsening degradation. Yeah, whereas if you flip back again, you actually notice that the change inside Borana has been in the opposite direction. Where it's degraded outside, we've actually seen massive recovery inside of Borana. And this is because we switched from sheep and goats. We had, I think, 13,000 sheep and goats. We were a sheep and Angora goat station. And we switched to cattle and then into conservation. And so what we utilize a lot of methods in terms of our management, primarily mob grazing. We now actually run all of our cattle as one single herd. So that's 2,000 head of cattle in one herd, rather than as individual herds of 200, 300 across the conservancy. And if you switch to the next one over now, and the next one. So this is what we've just implemented on Borana. So we've divided up Borana using obvious geographical features, dry riverbed, a road, a ridgeline, into 34 different grazing blocks. And each of these grazing blocks within it has a ecological outcome verification site. So this is a methodology developed by the Savory Institute for looking at, is what I'm doing working? You know, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And we have all of 34 short-term monitoring sites, so they will get monitored every single year. And we have 9 long-term monitoring sites, which that will have, we'll do soil carbon analysis on that every 5 years. And the verification goes from everything from, you know, how much bare ground is there? What is the insect presence? How is dung being broken down? What site-specific beneficial or problem plant species do you have? You know, oxidization, capping, all of these things, along with site-specific, you know, we're getting photographs that we take always in exactly the same place. So we're about to go into our second round of EOV, which will be happening in November. So that's enabling us to have a look at, actually, is what we're doing working? At the same time, we recently had with Natural State, paid for a LIDAR, very, very, very high density LIDAR survey, point cloud density LIDAR survey to be done of Borana, Llewellyn, which is our neighbor to the east, and the Ngarrindari Forest, which is a state-owned land which adjoins us, which is still part of the contiguous rhino habitat. And that is basically, they are ground truthing that, so they can start calculating off of that total surface carbon, but they've also putting in long-term carbon monitoring. And that monitoring is being done in places where there is livestock and wildlife, places where there is wildlife and no livestock, places where there's no wildlife or livestock, and places where there's livestock and no wildlife. So we have this, and on different soil types as well. So what we're hoping is going to be able to do for us is to be able to definitively say what is the correct approach in terms of rangeland health and carbon capture. Is it get everything out of there and just leave nature to take its course? Is it just having wildlife? Or is it just having cattle? Or is it a combination? Which is what we believe. It has to be a combination of livestock as a management tool, followed by, you know, our wildlife. And I mean, if you flick to the next slide, that is the result. This is what we see very regularly with us, is cattle, with rhino, with elephant. And yeah, and you know, this just makes me very happy. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Ryan, basically same question. If you can just give us a little background about Ol Jogi.
Yeah, sure. Quite a hard act to follow there, thanks, Lou. But yeah, so I'm kind of just going to go back to the beginning a bit. So I started off in South Africa, and obviously in South Africa it's a completely different situation to when you're looking at it in Kenya, where livestock is completely excluded from any conservation areas in South Africa. It's seen as a complete no. So moving up to Kenya, you know, coming onto these conservancies and seeing livestock coexisting with wildlife was a very interesting aspect to kind of take in and understand. So Ol Jogi's outlook on livestock at the moment is we're looking at getting it right on Ol Jogi first, making sure that we implement our correct rotational grazing programs, make sure that we get our habitat increasing, and ensuring that we know exactly what we're doing before we try and engage with communities and try and, you know, explain to them what to do to get the best outcome. We want to make sure that we're getting the best outcome first. So the cattle on Ol Jogi, as it stands, have been an incredible land restoration tool. We were chatting about a bit earlier, where we're using rotational boma systems, which is a little bit of an aspect from Alan Savory that we kind of take into this whole situation. But you know, if you look at Kenya as a whole, before we split everything up into conservancies, before we had these protected areas, it was all grazing land. It was all grazing land for tribes that were there initially. That all changed, and now we're trying to get back to that place where we need to understand that we have to live together in order for it to make it work for everyone. I think a big thing that we've started with in Ol Jogi that we've just done recently is we've just done our SAPR assessment, which is a social assessment of protected areas, and that really allowed us to engage with communities, you know, from all different levels. So from government all the way down to chiefs and everybody within the communities, surrounding Ol Jogi, and to be able to completely understand exactly what the challenges are outside before we try and address them. So if we come back to Ol Jogi itself, sorry, Jared, if you can just, so this is a map of Ol Jogi. We actually don't have that much community surrounding us. We've got Lekiji, which is kind of top left, and then on the top right, we've got Ilpulay community. In these two communities, we've got about 9,000 people that are sitting next to us. So as it stands, we funnily enough don't actually have that much livestock right on our borders. But we do, like Lou was explaining, we do bring livestock on, in drought conditions, which we're also changing our mentality towards now, where, the last drought that we just had over the last 2 years was so severe that we had nothing, as well as everyone else. So you can't supply anything to communities. So trying to bring it back to bringing them on when there is actually grass from the rainy season so that their outstanding areas can actually recover. I think another thing that we're approaching with communities to try and help with land restoration is that we've got a massive problem with the Puntia stricta. And what you find is, without the control of it, the minute you leave the conservancy, it is covering 70% of the ground. So there's actually very little for the grass to grow back on at this point in time. So what we've done is actually provided communities with greenhouses to be able to supplement cochineal insects to help control the cactus so that we can provide more ground for the grass to come back. So while that's happening during the rainy season, we want to bring them on and give that stuff a chance to recover. Sorry, Jared, if you can just go to the next one. So what we do at the moment, we've just incorporated LoRa collar sensors on our cattle on 7 herds, 7 sensors on 7 herds. And for those guys that don't know what LoRa is, it is a long-range data transfer system, small bits of data. So within the blocks on Ol Jogi, you can see now how we can actually monitor through heat maps exactly how much the cattle are grazing and where we need to focus on and where we need to pull cattle off of to make sure that we don't overgraze in any aspects. This also goes hand in hand with wildlife. So what ends up happening is with the wildlife, as soon as it rains, the wildlife end up going onto those green areas and they hammer it, and then we put the cattle on there and it gets even worse. So through these systems and through our blocks, we can then make sure we're placing the cattle in the optimum places to make sure that we get the optimum growth from the veld. On our blocks, we've also had 51 degrees that assisted us in setting up geofences. So if any one of these cattle cross one of those yellow boundaries, I get an instant WhatsApp that tells me that the cattle have crossed. I can go to my herdsman and I can say, guys, please push back into your block, so that we are 100% in control of the grazing that goes on Ol Jogi. It looks a bit frightening in the bottom corner there, and the reason for that is because that is one of the only corners of the conservancy that got consistent rain. So before we got there, with the cattle, there was actually a lot of grass. So they've spent a lot more time there than the rest of the conservancy. So if you just go to the next slide, please, Jared. So just give you an example of our rotational boma systems. So on the left-hand side, that's what the soil looks like before we start. After a week, which is the length of time we take to rotate the cattle, that's what the soil looks like. And then next slide. And then after 2 rainy seasons, that's what it ends up coming back as. So I think we'll get a little bit more into this later on. But yeah, that's kind of a description so far.
Thank you. Yeah, so all of you are dealing with conflict, especially in times of drought. So Tico, I'm wondering how you've engaged with the community, and especially if you can explain what coexistence looks like in Botswana.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. Can you go back to maybe the first slide? I want to just illustrate what Ryan was just pointing out with a map. This is an image of the southern buffalo fence that separates wildlife management from communal grazing lands. And most people have a tendency to misinterpret what this represents, because the wildlife side is in fact the grass on the left. And the degradation of grazing lands is a result of overgrazing and bush encroachment in a semi-arid desert. And so recovering grazing lands is a major part of having to address the cost of communal grazing and lack of management of livestock in a system that has not served the red zone subsistence farmers very well, because it's been shut down for 11 of the previous 20 years due to foot and mouth outbreaks. So, what does that mean when we engage communities? Well, it's how do we figure out ways to ensure reliable markets? How do we improve husbandry? And not to put too sharp a point on it, as a behavioral ecologist who's focused on the conservation of carnivores, we know that simply by crawling animals at night, you can eliminate about 90% of human-wildlife conflict that's focused on that derives from predators. So while mobile kraals are a part of our intervention, kraals themselves are a huge part of reducing the conflict that farmers have with wildlife. So there's another slide is there's a mobile kraal. We tend to move them, I think, every 2 weeks. They're easy to move, takes about 2 hours. We have an additional mobile system, which is called a mobile quarantine system, which addresses the need for quarantine to meet the obligations of a commodity-based trade conditions, which are laid out by the World Organization for Animal Health, which is a system, CBT beef is a system of production that basically eliminates 99% of any risk of exporting diseases that are related to overlap or exposure to wildlife. And of course, the big one that people are concerned with is, and veterinary departments in particular are apoplectic about, is foot and mouth disease. So a mobile quarantine system is now being implemented in these trialed in the villages that we work in, which allows farmers to put animals they want to sell into a quarantine system in situ, where we monitor their movements. We have in the next slide, we have trained community scouts who work both in either in ecological monitoring, grassland ecology, wildlife monitoring, or are trained professional herders in grassland, trained in ecology, in primary animal health care, and are working as professional herders, somewhat, again, adopting some of the methods of the Alan Savory methods, where we implement planned grazing through herding animals specifically in areas where they need to graze. And so the moving parts include capacity building, training, job creation, enterprise development, basic husbandry, and then awareness and education. So those are all the parts that we're trying to implement in the villages in Western Ngami land.
Thanks. Yeah, Lou, you already started talking about some of the changes you've seen in and around Borana. I'm wondering how you communicate the negative trends to the local community.
Well, you know, we're at the point now where it's incredibly easy for people to see that, you know, just from some of those satellite pictures I showed you, 20 years ago, there was some grass, now there is no grass. You know, their parents had cattle, and now they have goats. You know, it's a negative, you know, they can see the negative trend. It's trying to communicate with them, how can we effectively turn it around? That can be quite challenging, and especially we have such a dynamic landscape in terms of, you know, different pastoralist communities, different tribes. So where you make a plan with one community, quite often they might not see the results, the dividends of their work, because some guys from up the road come down with their cattle and their AKs and chase them out of there, and then their opinion is, well, if that's going to happen anyway, then I'm just going to eat it now, you know, because then at least I'm getting it. And so it's becoming it's something that we've seen. It needs to be almost simultaneously addressed across a very, very large area. And, how do you do that? Because it's a management issue. We need, it's something that they historically did very, very well, which is privately owned, communally managed livestock across a large rangeland. Now it is privately owned, privately managed, chaos that is ensuing. So how do we train people from those communities how to manage their livestock as as a collective? And we're kind of trying to come at this from two angles. One of it is we're trying to start a rangeland management and leadership school, which will run 1-year diploma courses on basically everything from rangeland management, animal health, erosion control and mitigation to conflict resolution. And the idea is that school, in each year of students, is going to have students from all of these in conflict communities, so that you have a guy whose cousin might have been stealing your cattle last week is in your class, so that they can go back and champion it from their end. So that's what we're trying to do on the broader scale. And on the more local scale, what we're trying to do is, our concept is, working concept is something called share stock. We're still trying to negotiate with the community exactly how it would work. But what we would essentially do is put all of the livestock, the private livestock from Borana and Llewellyn Dyer, which is another conservancy adjacent to Ol Jogi and just to one conservancy to the west of us. And we already manage our livestock as one unit. The idea is then we would put, with the community, they would put all of their livestock into that unit. And we use that now as a super cattle herd that we can use to put the maximum impact into community land when it's appropriate, and then rest the community land by bringing all of that livestock back onto the private conservancies. So it's something that we're quite excited about, but it has a lot of complications for us to do with wildlife and livestock ownership, and we're still kind of looking at how to do that. But one of our beginnings of how we want to start to do it is actually through donation of high genetic quality livestock to our local communities that will belong to them. They can begin to breed up from that and show that community as a whole the dividends of a communal livestock management program with inside and outside of the protected area.
Can you actually also touch on, before the session started, you were talking about how you handle livestock both in the dry season and in the wet season? I think it's important to really talk about that piece.
Yeah, so I alluded to it a little bit, and Ryan alluded to it a little bit as well. Traditionally, our interaction with community livestock was, it's a drought, our livestock are dying, you've got grass, we would like some of your grass, please. And obviously that then gave birth to our livestock to market program. But what we've actually started to do now is we try not to give emergency grazing in the dry season, because what we want to be doing is actually removing all of that livestock from degraded community land during the rainy season, so that the existing, what little grass there is, be it annuals and perennials and their grass planting programs and all the rest of it, so that has a chance to establish. Because what's happening now is, as soon as the shoot is that big, a goat's come through and ripped it out the ground, and you're just in a negative downward spiral at that point. So we've kind of looked at it from the point where ideally we're not giving you grazing during the drought, but what we will do is give you grazing to enable the regeneration of your rangeland. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, and Ryan, one of you can just talk about your relationship with the surrounding communities, and then also just some of the future projects that you're working on to better manage and improve the landscape.
Yeah, cool. So I touched on it a little bit earlier, but a big first step to working with the communities was obviously going through the whole SAPA procedure and re-establishing that connection and communication with the Conservancy. I think one of Ol Jogi's biggest downfalls up until that point was a lack of communication, understanding what the issues were. So that now we know, and we have got a community, liaison manager that works on Ol Jogi that is passing this information on all the time. So there's a constant form of communication between us, the chiefs, and whoever else has got an issue. I think that it's quite difficult, when you're working with communities on certain projects where, there's give and there's take. So what ends up happening is you've got a lot of give that comes from conservancies, but the feedback from the community is obviously a little bit lower than what you expect it to be, whether it's in a case of poaching firewood, or whether it's sending illegal grazing onto the conservancies and all these kinds of things. So it does get a bit tricky when you're trying to develop a good community relationship, when you're expecting the relationship to kind of be two ways, where it's never really going to be like that until you can escalate communities up to a specific level. And the same goes for livestock. And we're getting to the point now with our livestock programs, now that we've got the communications open, to be able to actually talk to the guys and say, okay, how can we help? What are the best things that we can do for you guys that we can actually achieve? Because another big thing that you don't want to do is overpromise and then underdeliver, which inevitably just ends up angering people more than actually sorting out the issue. So for Ol Jogi, what we're looking for in the future, because our LoRa systems span quite a wide area, we want to look into getting some LoRa sensors onto community cattle, try and help track where they're grazing, what's happening outside, to help better understand where we can maybe look at grazing programs, best grazing programs going forward in the future. Another thing that we are looking at with communities is veterinary assistance, making sure that cattle health is maintained, especially for everybody in the area. With our main roads that run through Ol Jogi, a lot of the times we've got hundreds of cattle that walk through, foot and mouth disease, CBBP, a whole lot of different diseases that can be transferred in a very short distance between their cattle and ours. So we can then say to them, right guys, once a month or once every 6 months, we're going to bring a vet on board. We're going to do vaccination programs with you guys. We're going to get your guys' cattle health checked and try and get them up to a sustainable level on that sense. Another thing that we're looking at is helping out with cattle kraals, bomering systems. We have donated quite a few gated bomer systems to the outside communities, which we will continue to do. And then also best practice with managing your livestock. So our livestock manager on Ol Jogi is working closely with the communities at the moment to explain and teach them, how Lou was explaining as well, just to be able to get guys on an understanding as to how it all works. You can't expect guys to make the right decisions if they're not informed correctly. So it's starting them at a grassroots level on education and bringing them up to the level where they understand, right, this is how your ecological cycle works, this is how grass works, this is what's going to happen if you do this, and this is what's going to happen if you do that. Once we can get that right, then we can start expecting better results and a much better relationship between ourselves and the communities, without just going, here guys, here's a lump sum of money, do whatever you need to do. We actually need to be there on the ground and taking guys through it step by step in order to get to where we're going. So that's kind of our plan over the next couple of years.
Cool. Yeah, so a lot of what we're talking about is coexistence and how we get there. So Tico, I'm wondering, your thoughts about new technologies that can be used to reach this model, and then also if you can highlight just some of your biggest successes that you had over the past 30 years.
So we don't use a great deal of technology just because I'm a bit of a Luddite, we have people on the ground. We currently employ over 75 people in our in Wild Entrust, and most of those are now trained community scouts who are trained in herding, grassland ecology, and wildlife monitoring. We use a smart platform, so as far as contemporary technologies, our scouts are all equipped with smart platforms collecting data as they're out, both in wildlife and in grassland metrics, as well as mapping where livestock are and where wildlife is, which feeds directly into the ability to discuss with the powers that be in the Department of Veterinary Services and the Department of Animal Health whether or not our animals are compliant with quarantine conditions that allow them access to international markets in the red zone. So there's a few technologies employed in this program, but it's really pretty basic for what we're trying to accomplish. But what we're really, the vision that we're trying to implement is a coexistence model that we can scale up to all these subsistence agriculture communities outside the wildlife management areas, so that those wildlife management areas are not being isolated as with a hard fence that is a hard interface where people and their enterprises are expected to live well on one side, and wildlife is supposed to be maintained and separated on the other. Partly because that doesn't work. We in Botswana have the largest remaining population of elephants in the continent, and fences don't tend to work terribly well when the elephants want to go from any point A to point B. And this has been so effectively demonstrated over the past several years when we've had reasonably good rains in Botswana, and elephants have distributed throughout northern Botswana in areas where people who are in their 50s and 60s as farmers said, we've never seen elephants here before. Why are they here? Well, they've now moved through the landscape with a growing elephant population, fences, irrespective of fences, but now they run into people where they can find water. And so elephant conflict has escalated, and so our human-wildlife conflict is not just about predators, but and our coexistence model is not just about predators, but about determining ways that people living in these rural landscapes actually can coexist with wildlife through moving through and connecting places like Kaudum National Park in northeastern Namibia and Babwata in the Zambezi region with the core of Botswana's wildlife areas in the Okavango Delta. So the vision is that connectivity with villagers actually living with a viable traditional livelihood that they've relied on for years. We're not going to convert them to wildlife managers. They want to be farmers. It's their culture, and we don't anticipate changing that. We just have to make it work for them.
Yeah, Lou, could you talk about programs that have had the most beneficial impact and how potentially you could scale them up?
Yeah, so I would say probably the one, I've alluded to already and spoken a little bit about it, is our livestock to market program has just been very, very successful for us, not only in terms of community education and relation and engagement, but also the economic stimulus into those communities. And it's, I think it's something that can be carried across into a lot of protected areas, because we can't continue to have a hard fortress mentality when it comes to conservation and community land. Yeah, if we don't start addressing the issues outside of our protected areas, then quite realistically, a lot of them, as has been alluded to several times in this week, is a lot of them are not going to survive. Because if you're the only island around, it's not going to matter whether you've got rhinos in there and rangers and a government mandate. If all of your neighbors are starving and their livelihoods are disappearing, there's going to come a point where they're not going to care that you've got rhino. So we need to have programs that engage with communities, with conservation, with livestock management. And, I said a few times, we use our livestock as a management tool for our rangeland. We don't have to burn. We have not burned Borana intentionally in a very, very long time. We haven't even had fires in a very, very long time because we do not have oxidized moribund grass. We utilize our livestock to manage the grass. That then means that our ecological carrying capacity on Borana is just increasing year on year. We can have more wildlife on the same area. We can have more cattle on the same area. And now so it means that we can bring community cattle in so that we can take our cattle out into community areas to have that same impact. We need to push the hard line out. You know, Tico's mentioned it a few times, and from that satellite imagery, you know, if you are living next to a fence, and on one side there's grass and there's wildlife, and then you're living in a desert with your livestock dying, it's not very long before you're going to have very significant conflict. So we just see livestock as this opportunity, A, for regeneration, but B, for increasing habitat for our megafauna species, for our umbrella species of elephant rhino. We would love, in some of the communities on our boundary, for them to get incorporated into our rhino management program, because we want it to be a mixture of private and state and community, because that's how it's going to survive, and that's how it's going to be resilient. So this engagement of community livestock in our rangeland management program for the Conservancy, I think, is one of the most important things that, you know, we're doing, because it shows that we're together. It's not us versus them. It's all of us together going forward together. And, you know, it's something that we've just started our first. It's taken 2.5 years, but we finally were allowed to go in and start to do our first ecological restoration program on community land. And within 2 weeks of us starting, they said, actually, can you do more? So next year we're going to do 1,000 acres. And then hopefully the next year can be 10,000 acres. And the next year can be 100,000 acres. And then 1 million acres. So that we can start, you know, we think we've tipped the first domino. And it's through constant community engagement. And now that that domino has fallen, we just want to capitalize on how can you just push this engagement and this education and this restoration as quickly as possible across as broad of a landscape as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess before we open up for questions, I want to give Ryan the opportunity to talk about more or less the effectiveness that you've seen with these cattle bomas, and then what other techniques are you using in Ol Jogi that would improve rangeland management?
Yeah, so the cattle boma rotations are an incredibly important way in almost guaranteeing the restoration of small pieces of land at a time. But where we need to be careful, and we were chatting about this a bit earlier, is the amount of time that you leave cattle within those designated bomas before you move them. So we've done various tests, and through the mistakes of people before, we've seen kind of how it can go wrong as well as how it can go right. So at the moment on Ol Jogi, we ship these bomas every week, so 7 days, which is actually still on the kind of longer side of things. But we found that if you boma, you know, and we're putting about 100 cattle within a 15 by 50 meter boma. So they're quite tightly packed, and you need that to really break up the soil and get that amount of nutrients back in from the cattle. And if you do it on a weekly basis, we find that within a season to 2 rainy seasons, you're getting pretty good regeneration of grass species in those areas. If you leave it too little, the grass that comes through is not very resilient, and it normally gets hammered by the wildlife quite quickly. If you leave it too long, a month or 2 months, you don't see any recovery for, you know, between 5 to 10 years. So it is quite an important thing that, you know, if you are going to do it on a conservancy, that you do your tests, because obviously all soil types are going to be different. They're all going to react differently in their regeneration. So to test exactly how long it's going to be. You know, you can really cover a lot of ground, especially bad ground that has got absolutely nothing on it in this method. And that's why cattle, like Lou was saying, why cattle can be so important for conservation and regeneration of landscapes if you do it properly, and if you've got enough cattle to actually make a difference at the same time. You know, other techniques that we're using on Ol Jogi at the moment for land restoration, we're using a lot of geotextile jute netting fences on your kind of not as steep areas that are capped, soil capped. A lot of mulch that we're putting behind that, which is helping us to kind of recover grass species, build up seed banks. We're trying to deal with a lot of really bad erosion sites first. We're trying to stabilize those soil systems before we're letting the cattle do their thing. And while they're busy going around, we're focusing on the more heavily eroded ground that's really going to become a problem in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's through your basics like your gabions, your rock packing, brush packing, all the rest of that. And we're having massive success at the moment. We've got El Nino coming, so it's already there. So next year is going to be terrible. But we're making good progress on it. And, what was interesting, if you look at the cattle bowman situation, what Lou was alluding to with regards to getting a mega herd system going, if done properly, can really make a massive difference in the landscape. But it's going to be very tricky in the different aspects of it. But yeah, it's a very, very important tool for our restoration.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm wondering if we have questions.
So, John Cox, WCS Kenya. Thanks, guys. So you guys have done a really sophisticated job of solving the problem locally with the kind of semi-nomadic peoples you have around your ranches. And you guys know about this, in a far more detailed way than me. I just have a layman's knowledge of the problem. But to the north of you guys, as I see it, you've got all of these community lands, and you've got uneducated, fairly disenfranchised people in very, very dry areas with hardly any grazing. And every year there seems to be more people, there seems to be more cows. How threatened is your delicate equilibrium that you've reached with those local communities around your conservancies by those people coming down, as they do, when they run out of grass, smash your fences and come in? And I suppose the other part of the question is, strategically, how does Kenya go about solving that problem on a national level?
Okay, so we have had, in the past, we did have issues with land invasions and, people illegally coming in and grazing inside of Borana. We solved that 100% by community engagement. Yeah, but so now the front line, instead of it being on Borana, is on our neighbors to the north. It's on the Mokogodo Forest, Ilingwezi and Lekaruki group ranches, and McNutt. And ideally, we want to keep just pushing it that way. We want to, through education and engagement, and empowerment of communities, because the thing is a lot of these projects, they need to be driven by the community. If I go in and try and drive it, when I go away, it's probably not going to succeed. So it needs to be empowering the communities, giving them the tools with which to push this, fixing their land, fixing their problems, so that, and also it's, you end up with this looking over the fence mentality. Last time I was here, this place was completely shagged. And now look, it's much better. How did they do that? Excellent, can we come and learn from you? So this is the thing, is if we start this, now we don't want them to be coming and looking at Borana or Ol Jogi and going, oh, look at this amazing intact ecosystem, how did you do this? We want them to be going to our site on McNutt or on Ilingwezi and going, holy smokes, you guys, how did you do this? Because it needs to be driven by them. And, I think on the second thing, which is like a much more national level, but I would say it's almost a more global level, actually, the most important thing we can do is not to do with livestock. It's to do with water. Our biggest challenge that we have globally is what happens when it rains. Where does that water go? Does it go into the ground, or does it go as fast as possible down the hill, carrying as much material as possible directly to the ocean, and then you've got flood, drought, flood, drought. Think about how many times you see that in the news. That is because we've accelerated our hydrological cycle. So the best thing that we can do is to interrupt that. how do we stop and slow water within the ecosystem with which it falls and infiltrate it into the ground? Because that's now going to lead to extended periods of green because there's enough moisture. That's more transpiration, which means more localized weather. That's more dew. That's more local rainfall. Longer rainy seasons, which means you can start to stabilize your climatic patterns. But until we start putting water in the ground, it doesn't really matter what grazing program you have. Yeah, it doesn't matter what tree planting program you have. It doesn't really matter what education program you have, what outreach program you have. If you do not fix the water issue, the rest of it is going to collapse anyway because they're going to be living in a desert. Yeah, so that on like a national strategy side is definitely the way to go, is on water, rainwater capture and harvesting. You know, on the site on McNutt, where our rehabilitation site is, we estimate that every single year, this is on a pretty low rainfall area, they say they never have any water. They're having water piped 50 kilometers from Mount Kenya to that community. On that 150 acres, they get 480 million liters of surface runoff in a year. That is a ridiculous amount of water. And if you look at on the entire 3 billion acres of northern Kenya, you can imagine that that is, you know, trillions of liters of water that are just going. So, yeah.
Yeah, any other questions?
Thanks very much for that, guys. PJ Roberts from Wildlife Act in KZN, South Africa. Obviously, you guys have touched on elements, different elements in terms of South Africa versus the rest of Africa and the fences problem and all of that. But some of the challenge around grazeland management, at least from our side, has been sort of governance and engagement with communities and private livestock owners, you know, wanting to do their thing, and you might get buy-in from one or two of them, but it needing to be a collective thing. So I'm just wondering if you had any sort of insights or thoughts or suggestions on experiences, I guess, on how that approach has worked in terms of engagement, with the collective, if you will.
Sorry, just a little thing to add to that, which was interesting to see when we went through these SAPR assessments. So the minute the government were put on the spot, so they had to be in the same room with the communities being asked the same questions, all of a sudden you started to see a bit more action than when you're trying to send a message down to Nairobi that you hope gets to so-and-so down the line, which never does. So a lot of it is having to get the higher up people into the same room and have those conversations face to face with the guys. And until that happens, without government buy-in, you know, and coming from a higher end, trying to get that stabilization and you know, partnership is, in my opinion, very, very difficult to do. So that's the change that I saw as soon as we had that SAPA meeting and we managed to get everybody into a room from the lowest to the highest. We started to see a lot more results because they are now being held accountable for the lack of governance and whatever the specific issues were. And now we've got our community liaison officer who can then follow up on that and then pushes the government for answers and results with the community, so now they're under pressure.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, yeah, the biggest a bit of advice I can give you is patience. It is, what we are doing is a product of 30 years worth of dialogue, yeah? And obviously, you know, we've learned a lot, and in our landscape, it's enabling us to show the successes that those communities have had, enables us to impact other communities faster. But still, within the communities that we're working, you know, if you imagine McNutt, where we've got the rehabilitation program, has got 6,000 shareholders. Yeah, they all have an opinion, and some of them might not like the guys who are in charge. So just by virtue of the fact that humans don't agree, it can make it very, 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 very challenging. But it comes down to patience and trust. You know, you need to build up that trust. We have
such a strong relationship with our community because we have very high local employment rate. We're sitting at about 96% local employment. You know, all of our purchasing happens there. Our rangers are out there way more than they're looking after rhino within the Conservancy. They're dealing with issues external to the Conservancy, cattle rustling, you know, because they're all of our rangers have to be National Police Reservists. You know, it's a question of trust and dialogue and patience and just repeating yourself until you're blue in the face. And, you know, they have, I don't know about the rest of Africa, but in Kenya, they love to have a meeting where everyone will stand up and say the same thing. And it can take 8 hours, yeah? But you've got to do that. And you've got to go the next day and have the same thing happen again. And it's about patience and dialogue. But the dividends from that patience and that dialogue can be stratospherically high. You know, we don't have land invasions onto Borana, no matter how bad things are. We don't have poaching that much, because if you want to get to Borana, you need to have gone through a landscape which is filled with your employees' cousins and brothers, and, you know, their livelihood is coming from Borana. So they're like, I don't know this guy who's walking through here with a gun. So they call up their cousin who's the head ranger and go, by the way, there's some, you know, ne'er-do-wells around here. And it just means that we have, through that engagement, you know, a lot of security. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're actually out of time. So if you have additional questions, all of you guys are around, so we're certainly here. So I just want to thank our three panelists and thank you all for listening.